Hey friends, this is Seams and Finishes with Heather Rose Johnson, Part 2. You will need the following tools pictured here, so stop the video, collect your tools, and come back. Today I'm using my basic Bernette sewing machine. There's my reverse button. Here's my stitch width, and if you look closely, there's a dot right in the middle, and that tells me that my needle is centered. And if I turn it all the way to 0, then the needle will move to the left. So watch the needle as I turn the knob, and you can see it move from left to right. We want it centered. Next, let's set the stitch length to 2.5, and there's a line on my machine, and that is where it will mark the stitch length, 2.5. And then I want straight stitch, and on my machine it's letter A, corresponding with the straight stitch. I'm going to point out the tension dial. On my machine it's set on 5, and I'm going to leave it there. I'm using a darker thread for demonstration purposes so you can see clearly. Okay, let's get started. My machine is threaded, but I need to pick up the bobbin thread from below. So I'm going to thread the eye of the needle, and then I'm going to turn the hand wheel towards my body enough so the needle goes down once and then back up, and then I will gently pull on the upper thread to lift the bobbin thread to the surface. Then I can tuck those two threads underneath my presser foot and I can get started. We are going to be using a 5/8 seam allowance, which is the most common. And on the metal throat plate, it is located here. You can see there's also 4/8 or a half an inch. There's 3/8, and then conveniently a 1/4 seam allowance lines up with the right side of the presser foot. As we move through our samples, I will guide you on how to use the different guidelines for your seam allowance. Okay, so go ahead and stop the video and cut some fabric if you haven't already. If this is the first time that you've done either a French seam or a flat felled seam, I recommend practicing first. We're going to start by practicing just a straightforward 5/8 seam. I chose this Gold Ladybug fabric on purpose. You can see the wrong side or the back of the fabric, and the gold ladybugs are on the right side or the outside of the fabric. I'm going to demonstrate how to sew a straight seam with 5/8 seam allowance. First step, you're going to place the fabric with right sides touching. And for this demonstration, I'm going to stitch along this top edge here. I'm going to pin my fabric together. Using my straight pins, I'm going to pin perpendicular to the seam. Place your work under your presser foot and line up the raw edge with the 5/8 line. If you don't have that line, you can measure out with a ruler. You're going to start about 1/4 of an inch down from the top edge. Presser foot down. Make sure your needle is down. I like to advance forward, count to 3, stop, go backwards all the way to the raw edge, and then continue forward. Remove your pins as you go. I like to instill good habits from the beginning. Once you reach the end, you're going to back stitch at the end, and then make sure your needle is all the way up, and then lift your presser foot and pull your work out to the left and trim your threads. Okay, let's examine our work. So you can see my stitch line and you can see my 5/8 seam allowance. I'm going to open the work. This would be the outside. If you look at the seam allowance, it will fray. So what can you do to stop the fabric from fraying? I'm going to show you the French seam. I love the French seam. It's beautiful on the inside and the outside. So the first step, you're going to place wrong sides together, and it's going to feel wrong because this is really the only time that you do this. The first seam that we stitched was a standard 5/8 seam, and we started with right sides touching. But for our French seam, we're going to start with the wrong sides touching. So pin your fabric together, and you're going to pass the fabric through the machine twice. The first pass, you're going to stitch a 1/4 seam allowance. You're going to place your work underneath your presser foot, and if you remember from earlier in the video, a 1/4 seam allowance lines up perfectly with the right side of the presser foot. And you might want to measure yours just to double check, but it should be close to 1/4 inch. So just like all the other seams that we've practiced, you're going to start at the beginning, you're going to back stitch, and you're going to advance forward using your presser foot as your guide. So you're making your little micro movements, steering the fabric to make sure that that raw edge on the right lines up with the right side of your presser foot. Okay, of course, back stitch at the end. Make sure your needle's up, lift your presser foot, pull your work out to the side, clip your threads, and we'll move on to the next step. Next, you will trim your 1/4 inch seam allowance. You will cut about half of the width off of your seam allowance, and you'll see why this is important for the next step. Take your sample to the ironing board, open up your work, press the seam allowance to one side, it doesn't matter, pick a side, and then gently press with your iron. If you're using natural fibers, steam is good. Okay, now you're going to fold the sample so right sides are touching, and I can see that seam that I've created. I'm going to make sure that that seam is laying along that edge, and then I will press again. Now we're ready for the second pass. So take the sample to the machine, and we're going to stitch 3/8 seam allowance. So 1/4 from the first pass plus 3/8 equals 5/8. If you don't have the lines on your metal throat plate, that's okay. Take a ruler and you can measure out from your needle to the right and simply place a piece of tape, and you can use that as your guide. Let's examine our finished work. You have just completed the French seam and it looks beautiful. This is a wonderful way to finish your seam allowance so that your fabric does not fray. The second sample that we're going to do today is called a flat felled seam. And one simple way to create a flat felled seam is to sew a French seam, just like we did, and then top stitch. The goal is to stitch through all layers. You want to stitch through the top of the fabric, catching your seam allowance on the underside. Now, your thread on top is more attractive visually. So if you can comfortably top stitch by looking at the outside of your work, you will end up with a more beautiful finish. So I'm using my fingers and I can feel the seam allowance, the thickness of the seam allowance, and that helps guide me. And I'm lining up the seam with the right side of my presser foot to make sure I stitch in a straight line. If you wanted to flip the work over and stitch looking at the seam allowance, that's fine, you can do that. And I will demonstrate that option in the next sample. All right, done and done. So this is one way to create a flat felled seam, and you could go back and do a second row of top stitching for decoration if you wanted to. Okay, let's start option 2. I have already stitched a 5/8 seam. So if you want to practice along with me, pause the video, get your fabric, stitch a straight seam with 5/8 seam allowance, and then come on back. The first step, we are going to open up the seam allowance, and we are going to trim one layer of the seam allowance. I would trim about half of the width maybe a little bit less than half. This technique that we're doing now is one you might see on a man's dress shirt, the seam around the armhole. So I'm trimming one layer of the seam allowance. The next step, we're just focusing on the seam allowance. You're going to lay your work so that you can fold the other side of the seam allowance over the cut edge. So you're wrapping the fabric around that raw edge. I would take this to the iron and I would press it. Now it's time to top stitch. So last time I looked at the outside of the work. This time I'm going to look at the inside of the work while I stitch. And I'm going to be using the left folded edge of my seam allowance as my guide. So I'm going to stitch along the left edge of my seam allowance as close to that folded edge as possible. Okay, I had to stop working because my bobbin ran out of thread, and you'll see here that my top stitching is not complete. So what I need to do is unpick my stitching and start over, and I need to fill up my bobbin with more thread. There is nothing more frustrating than when your bobbin runs out of thread. So at the beginning of your project, let's say you're making an entire garment, fill 2 or 3 bobbins. If you're just doing a minor repair or hemming a pair of pants, then filling your bobbin halfway should be enough for your project. Okay, let's try that again. So you can decide if you want to look at the outside of your work, and top stitch you may. I'm going to look at the inside, and I'm going to stitch close to the folded edge of my seam allowance. So don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. Alright, so my second flat felled seam is finished. Now if you look at it compared to the first one, they're identical, but they are made using 2 different techniques. You can choose the one that you like best. If you've been watching my other sewing videos, then you know I save my samples and I put them into my sewing skills portfolio. I can make notes and I can write down the steps, and I use it as a reference tool, and I encourage you to do the same. Each video builds upon the previous video, and my goal is to give you the skills that you need to build a strong sewing foundation. Hey friends, thanks for watching my video. I hope it was helpful, and stay tuned, there are lots more videos to come. Please subscribe to my channel and share with your friends, and as always, learn to sew, love to sew.